My mother-in-law said I was a guest in her son's business. I was a co-signer on the spa loan that kept it alive. She found out at the creditor hearing. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. There is a particular kind of invisibility that looks, from the outside, like contentment. You attend the dinners and the ribbon cuttings and the press events. You are present in the photographs on the restaurant walls, spouse of the founder, there in the background. Slightly out of focus, you do not speak in the meetings. You do not appear on the organizational chart. You have no title, no email with the company domain, no line in the press releases. And so everyone, including the man who asked you to sign, begins to believe that you are a guest at the table, rather than one of the people who built it. Sylvia Prescott had been invisible inside the Prescott Restaurant Group for 9 years. Then the creditors arrived, and the settlement stalled, and the only name in the room with the legal authority to stop the entire proceeding was the one nobody had been looking at. I want to begin with what invisibility actually costs, because I think we talk about it in terms of dignity and professional credit, the recognitions that don't come, the salary that isn't there, the title that belongs to someone else. Those are real costs. But the specific cost I did not calculate until the night I sat at the kitchen table with the blue binder open and the settlement documents beside it. Was this: when you are invisible inside a family business, you are still present inside the legal documents. Your name is still on the paper. Your creditworthiness is still attached to the loan. Your signature still carries exactly the authority it carried the day you gave it, and the law does not adjust that authority to account for how the family has chosen to think of you since. My name is Sylvia Prescott. I am 41 years old. I grew up in San Antonio, the daughter of an insurance agent who believed, as a professional and personal principle, that you never signed a document without reading it, and never read a document without keeping a physical copy. He said this at the dinner table when I was 12, when I was getting my first job at 17, when I moved into my first apartment at 22. It was not advice, exactly. It was more like the way certain families pass down the habit of maintaining the car or checking the weather before traveling. It was simply what you did. By the time I was an adult, it was automatic, before the restaurant group required my full attention. I was a hospitality operations coordinator at a hotel group in Austin. This is a title that sounds generic and covers an enormous range of essential, unglamorous work: vendor scheduling, inventory systems, staffing coverage plans, the logistics architecture that makes a hospitality operation run smoothly when nothing is going according to plan. I was good at this. I had a quick memory for numbers, a habit of locating the potential failure point before it became an actual one, and the specific patience that operations work requires. When Gareth asked me to bring that attention to the restaurant group, I chose to do it. I believed in the project, and I believed in Gareth, and I thought, the way people think at the beginning of these arrangements, that the contribution would be recognized, that the absence of a formal title was a temporary condition, that belonging to a thing was eventually the same as being acknowledged by it. I was wrong about that, but I kept the binder. Gareth Prescott was 44 years old, my husband, co-owner of the Prescott Restaurant Group. He understood hospitality in an instinctive, bone-level way that is difficult to teach and impossible to fake. He knew what made a room feel generous, what made a menu feel coherent, what made a customer feel that they had been seen rather than processed. He was charming without effort in investor conversations and in the public life of the restaurants. In private, in his relationship with his mother, he was something different, deferential in a way that went beyond respect into a specific kind of learned helplessness, an inability to hold a position with her that I had watched develop over 9 years of marriage without being able to interrupt it. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had never learned to occupy his own authority in his mother's presence, and that failure had, over time, allowed Vivienne's reach to extend into spaces where it did not belong. Vivienne Prescott was 68 years old, the founding co-owner of the group, the woman who had provided the original capital when Gareth was 28 and had nothing but belief and a good eye for what made a restaurant work. She had a right to her position and her pride in it. What she did not have a right to, though she exercised it consistently, was the authority she claimed over every subsequent decision the group made, treating her founding investment as a permanent and total claim on the direction of the business and on the people in it. She was never cruel to me in a way that was specific enough to address. She was something more subtle and more persistent than cruel. She was consistently and systematically dismissive, in ways that accumulated over 9 years into a complete and detailed picture of how she regarded me. She had never used my last name correctly at a public event in 9 years of my marriage to her son. She called me Sylvia Gareth, as though I were an addendum, a footnote, an attachment to her son's legal identity rather than a person with my own name on my own documents. I had corrected it twice. Privately, nothing had changed. The Prescott Restaurant Group operated 3 locations in Austin. South Congress, the original, a neighborhood restaurant that had earned a devoted following over 8 years, the kind of place where the staff knew the regulars and the menu evolved with the seasons in a way that felt earned rather than calculated. Bolden Creek, the second location, opened 4 years after the original, a slightly more ambitious concept in a neighborhood that was beginning to develop faster than anyone had anticipated. East 6th, the newest, opened 2 years before this story begins, a louder, more contemporary space designed for the younger Austin demographic that was reshaping that corridor. And the location that had required the largest capital investment, and consequently, the spa loan that would eventually become the most important document in my life. The blue 3-ring binder that I kept was assembled 6 years before this story. The kind with clear plastic sleeves on the outside, slightly too large for a standard bookshelf. Organized with tabbed dividers into 6 sections in the order the loan documents appeared: application summary, co-borrower designation, personal financial statements, property disclosures, repayment schedule, miscellaneous correspondence. When Gareth and I signed the spa refinancing, I had attended the signing meeting with a folder of my own questions and had stayed for the full presentation. The loan was $1.1 million, structured to refinance 2 earlier creditor obligations and provide capital for the East 6th construction. The spa required, as a condition of approval, a co-borrower with documented creditworthiness. Gareth asked me to serve in that role. I agreed. I signed. I took my copies home and put them in the binder and put the binder in the hall closet, in a box labeled financial, and I left it there for 6 years. I want to tell you what the hall closet looked like, because these physical details matter to me and because they matter to the story. It was a deep closet at the end of the hallway of our Austin house, the kind of closet where holiday decorations and archival files and the things you might need someday but do not need today eventually stack themselves into layers. The financial box was on the second shelf from the bottom, pushed back against the wall, with a box of tax returns stacked on top of it. The blue binder was visible through the gap at the top of the box when the box was open. I had not opened the box in 6 years because I had not needed to. I knew exactly where the binder was. That was enough. The warning signs arrived in 2 distinct forms, and I want to be precise about them, because the specificity matters for anyone listening who might be in a similar position. The first came from Vivienne directly, the restaurant group's largest supplier, a food and beverage distributor that had been under contract with all 3 locations for 7 years. Had filed a creditor claim arising from an invoicing dispute that had been escalating for months. Vivienne and Gareth had been managing the dispute through the group's attorney without telling me the full details, which was consistent with the pattern of the previous 9 years. One evening, Vivienne arrived at our house unannounced with a folder of documents, a settlement authorization package. She described it and handed it to me across the kitchen counter with the instruction that I did not need to read these. She just needed my signature. Just my signature. 7 words I had heard in some form many times before, and that had always, in my professional and personal experience, been worth pausing on. You don't need to read it. Just sign. I took the folder. I set it on the kitchen table. I told Vivienne I would look at it that evening. She smiled in a way that communicated that looking at it was a courtesy rather than a right, and she left. Gareth called that evening to ask whether I had signed. I asked why specifically my signature was required, given that I had no formal title in the group. He said it was procedural, that the SPA documentation required co-borrower acknowledgement of any major settlement disposition. I asked whether that meant the settlement would affect the SPA loan. He said it was just a formality. There was the word again. I said I thought I should read the settlement before I signed it. He said, of course, take whatever time you needed. His voice had a specific flatness that told me the time he expected me to need was approximately none. I put the settlement folder on the kitchen table and went to the hall closet and took out the financial box and opened the blue binder. The second warning came from a mutual acquaintance at a dinner we attended 2 weeks earlier. She mentioned, in the casual aside of someone sharing professional news she had heard secondhand, that she had heard the restaurant group was reorganizing. Something about a new LLC. Something involving the East 6th location. She mentioned it the way people mention news about businesses they have no particular stake in, not realizing it was information I didn't have. I went home that night and asked Gareth about the LLC. He said it was a structural thing, part of the creditor negotiations, and that the attorneys were handling it. He did not say when it had been formed. He did not say that he and Vivienne had transferred the East 6th location's lease and equipment into it 14 months earlier, without telling me and without my consent, as a strategy to protect that location's assets from the supplier's creditor claim. I found this out later. But the morning after the dinner, I called my sister Bet in San Antonio. Bet is a practical person who has understood the Prescott family dynamics with more clarity than I have for most of the 9 years I have been part of them. because she has watched from outside without the obligation of being inside. She said, "Sylvia, do you know what you actually signed in 2017? I went back to the blue binder. The co-borrower designation was on page 3 of the main agreement. My name, Sylvia Jean Prescott. My social security number, my credit history documentation, and a reference to an attached rider. I found the rider in the miscellaneous correspondence section, the 6th and last section of the binder, in the sleeve at the very back. It was a 1-page addendum that the SPA had required as a condition of the loan's approval, because the agency had determined that the co-borrower designation needed to be paired with documented equity to satisfy their underwriting requirements. The rider identified me as a 10% equitable owner of the Prescott Restaurant Group. Gareth had added this rider 6 years ago, at the SPA's specific insistence, without telling me it existed. I read the rider twice. Then I read it again. Then I set it on the table next to the settlement documents Vivienne had given me and read both documents together, in the specific way that a person reads 2 things side by side when she is trying to understand how they relate to each other. The settlement, as Vivienne had drafted it, would resolve the supplier's creditor claim by liquidating the South Congress and Bolden Creek locations and distributing the sale proceeds to the creditor. The East 6th location, already transferred into the new LLC 14 months ago, was not part of the settlement. It had already been moved out of the group structure. The SPA loan, still outstanding, still secured by the family home, still bearing my name as co-borrower, would remain entirely in place after the settlement. 2 locations liquidated, the creditor satisfied, the newest and most valuable location protected in the new LLC, and me personally exposed to a $1 million federal loan that was now attached to assets that the settlement would eliminate from the group's balance sheet. Vivienne's plan required my signature to execute. She had counted on my giving it without reading the documents, because for 9 years the assumption had been that my role was to be present and cooperative and grateful for inclusion, not to be someone who understood what she was signing or why it mattered. I called Gareth at 11 o'clock that night. I said, "Your mother's settlement plan will liquidate the group's primary assets to pay the creditor and leave me personally liable for the federal loan with no group assets to support it." He said Vivienne had spoken with the attorneys and it was all being handled. He said, "You're not in the business, Sylvia. Let us manage the business." I said, "I am in the business enough that the SPA required my personal guarantee and documented me as a 10% equitable owner." He had nothing to say to that. I heard him breathing on the phone. I waited. He said nothing that addressed what I had told him. I said goodnight and hung up. I called Derek Moss at 11:15. Derek was a commercial and insolvency specialist whose name I had been given by my father's estate attorney 2 years earlier and had saved in my phone under the label just in case. He answered on the 4th ring. I described the situation in the order I had understood it: the settlement documents, the co-borrower designation, the equity rider, the LLC transfer, the timeline. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Come in tomorrow morning and bring the binder." We met at 9. Derek's office was on South Lamar, an open, organized space where the conference room table was always clean and the files on the credenza were always labeled. He read the binder documents and the settlement package while I drank coffee and watched the Austin morning through the window. After 30 minutes, he looked up and said, "This settlement cannot proceed without your consent. You are a co-borrower under federal loan documents. Your signature is legally required for any disposition of collateralized assets. Without your consent, the creditor committee cannot finalize the settlement terms." He said it as information. I received it as information. It was, in one sense, very simple. The document I had signed 6 years ago, the one Vivienne had assumed was a formality, was the only thing standing between the settlement and execution. Derek filed a formal notice that afternoon with the creditor committee and the SPA's local office. Sylvia Prescott, co-borrower and documented 10% equitable owner of the Prescott Restaurant Group, had not consented to the proposed settlement terms. The creditor committee acknowledged the notice. The hearing was held. Vivienne's attorney's response arrived 2 days later. The argument was that I was a nominal co-signer with no material ownership interest, that the equity rider was a technical designation made to satisfy an SPA administrative requirement, and did not reflect any actual operational role or genuine ownership stake in the business. Derek's response was to produce, in sequence, my personal financial statement from the original loan application, my W-2 from a year in which I had been placed on the group payroll, and the equity rider itself, with the SPA's own language confirming that the documented equity designation was a required component of the co-borrower approval. The creditor committee reviewed the documents and paused the hearing. Vivienne left the room. She was gone 4 minutes exactly. When she returned, her expression had not changed in its surface features. The composure was intact. The posture was intact. But something beneath the composure had shifted. It was the specific expression of a person who has walked into a room believing she has accounted for every variable and has discovered in the 4 minutes she spent outside. That one variable was different from what she had assumed. At the resumed hearing, Derek presented 3 items: the co-borrower agreement and equity rider I have already described. The third item was a letter from the registered agent of the new LLC, the one formed 14 months ago to hold the East 6th lease, confirming the date on which the transfer had been executed. The transfer had occurred 14 months before the supplier's creditor claim was filed. Derek looked at the creditor committee's counsel and let that date register. A preference transfer, an asset moved out of a debtor's estate in anticipation of a creditor claim, in a way that disadvantages the creditor who would otherwise have claims against that asset. Under federal insolvency rules, such a transfer can be voided and the asset restored to the pre-transfer condition. The supplier's attorney, who had until that moment been aligned with Vivienne's settlement framework, asked for a private conference with Gareth's attorney. They were out of the room for 11 minutes. When they returned, the supplier's attorney said, "We'd like to revisit the structure of the settlement." I did not speak during any of this. I had the blue binder open on the conference table in front of me, turned to the page with the equity rider. A yellow sticky tab marked the top of the page. I had placed the tab there that morning before the hearing, in the same way I had placed tabs throughout the binder over the years, not because I anticipated a specific moment, but because a document that is organized and accessible is a document that is ready to be used. My father had taught me that. I had carried it into every professional and personal filing I had made since I was 18 years old. The renegotiation that followed the hearing took 11 days. Derek worked with the creditor committee's counsel and the SPA's representative on a restructured settlement that resolved the supplier's claim through a new payment schedule without requiring liquidation of any restaurant location, formally documented my 10% ownership in the group's restructured articles, released me from the personal spa liability in exchange for my co-signature on a restructured federal repayment plan that the spa accepted in writing, voided the LLC transfer and returned the East 6th lease and equipment to the group structure, and removed Vivienne from the operations committee, replacing her with an independent third-party operator per the restructuring agreement's terms. Gareth retained his co-ownership stake. He retained his role as the public face of the group. He called me from the parking lot after the final settlement signing and asked whether there was anything we could do about the marriage. He said he was sorry, in the way that men say they are sorry when they have allowed something to happen without believing they caused it. I told him I needed more time than he was probably expecting. I meant this precisely. I needed time, not performance time, not negotiating time, but genuine time, the kind that lets you understand what a decision actually is before you make it. 2 years after the settlement, I operate a consulting practice in Austin's Mueller neighborhood. I work with restaurant operators and small food service businesses on the structural and operational systems that make them resilient rather than fragile. My name is on my own business filings, my own invoices, my own client agreements, my own tax documents. I charge for my time and my knowledge. The blue binder is in the bottom drawer of my office desk. I have not opened it since the day Derek placed it on the conference table. I know exactly what it contains and exactly where it is. Some people will hear this story and think the lesson is about Vivienne, or about Gareth's failure to protect me. Those things are real. But the lesson I carry is simpler and more portable than either of them. On the day I signed the SPACO borrower agreement, I read the documents, asked my questions, kept my copies, and put them where I could find them. That decision, made 6 years earlier, on an ordinary afternoon before any of this was visible, was the decision that mattered. Everything else followed from it. Let me tell you more about the 9 years before the hearing. Because they are not background, they are the substance of what this story is about. The invisible years are the ones that created the conditions for what happened at the creditor table, and I think it is important to render them with some precision. When Gareth and I married, the South Congress location had been open for 2 years. It was doing well, not enormously, not on the scale that would come later, but steadily, with a growing reputation and a loyal neighborhood customer base that was beginning to tell their friends. Vivienne was at the restaurant 4 days a week. She had opinions about everything: the playlist, the uniform policy, the way the servers described the specials. Most of those opinions were good ones. She had an eye for the customer experience that was genuinely useful. But she also had opinions about who belonged in which part of the business, and those opinions were absolute. She managed the front of house with authority and managed the back of house by delegation to Gareth, and she managed me by omission. I was not included in operational meetings. I was not copied on supplier correspondence. I was not consulted when staffing decisions were made that affected my scheduling work. I was thanked, sometimes, in the way that people thank someone who has set the table, warmly, briefly, and without acknowledgement of the specific skill or effort involved. I want to be precise about why I did not resist this more vigorously in the early years, because I think it is a question worth answering honestly. The first reason is that I was new to the family and to the business, and I understood that new people need to prove themselves before their authority expands. That is a reasonable principle. I accepted it. The second reason is that Gareth's support, when I went to him privately with concerns about Vivienne's treatment, was genuine but insufficient. He heard me. He agreed with me. He had conversations with Vivienne that I was not present for, and that, as far as I could tell, did not change anything. He was caught between us, and his resolution was always to smooth rather than to decide, and over time I learned to raise fewer things because raising them cost energy that produced no return. The third reason, and I say this without pride, is that the work was real, and I was good at it, and the restaurants were succeeding, and there is a particular kind of satisfaction in watching something you have contributed to become something that matters to people. I stayed because the work meant something to me, and because I believed that meaning was eventually visible to the people around me, and because I was wrong about that in a way I did not fully understand until the evening I sat at the kitchen table with the settlement documents and the blue binder open side by side. The hall closet where I kept the binder was the last closet on the right as you walked toward the master bedroom. It was a deep closet with 2 shelves, one at eye level and one at waist level. And the financial box was on the waist level shelf, pushed to the back, with a box of tax returns on top of it, and a crate of Gareth's conference materials to the left of it. The hall had good light in the evening, because the window at the end of the corridor caught the western sun, and whenever I walked past that closet in the last hour before dark, the door was warm from it. I had opened the closet perhaps a dozen times in the 6 years since I had put the binder there, always for something else. The holiday decorations, Gareth's archive boxes, the extra linens. I had seen the financial box every one of those times. I had registered it and moved on. On the evening I went back to it, I moved the tax return box aside, opened the financial box, and pulled out the blue binder without hesitation. Not because I expected to find what I found. Because my father had given me a habit, and I trusted the habit, and when someone tells you that you don't need to read a document before you sign it, the habit activates before the reasoning does. The conversation with Derek Moss, the morning after I called him, was the kind of conversation that reorganizes the way you understand your own position. Not because he told me anything I had not suspected or couldn't have inferred from the documents, but because hearing it from someone who understood the legal weight of what the documents said made it real in a different way, converted it from a thing I suspected into a thing I knew. He explained, slowly and without condescension, the structure of the problem. As a co-borrower on a federal spa loan, my signature was not a formality. It was a legal requirement for any action that materially affected the collateralized assets or the loan structure. The creditor settlement Vivienne had presented to me would have done both. Would have disposed of major collateral assets and restructured the group's liability profile. And it required my explicit written consent under the terms of the spa loan agreement. Without my consent, the creditor committee could not finalize the settlement. The hearing would stall. He also explained the equity rider, because I wanted to understand what the spa had actually required when they insisted on it. The spa's co-borrower standards, he told me, require that a co-borrower have a documentable stake in the business, not merely a credit profile. The agency uses the equity documentation as additional assurance that the co-borrower has both the means and the motivation to support the loan's repayment. Gareth had provided the spa with documentation of my 10% ownership in order to satisfy this requirement. He had not told me he had done this. He had treated it as an administrative detail, a box that needed to be checked to get the loan closed, rather than as a material fact about my legal position in the business. I thought about that for a long time in Derek's conference room, about the specific decision to treat a legal documentation of ownership as an administrative technicality that did not need to be disclosed to the person being documented. What does that decision mean, exactly? It means that Gareth had understood that my documented ownership was a tool, useful to the business when it needed something from the spa, invisible when it might complicate his mother's plans. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. The days between the preliminary notice Derek filed and the resumed creditor hearing were quiet, in the way that a room is quiet just before a decision is made. Gareth and I were still living in the same house. We were civil. We were careful. We moved around each other in the kitchen and the hallway with the specific precision of two people who have run out of productive things to say to each other in the current moment and are waiting for the moment to change. He did not try to argue me into consenting to the original settlement. He had tried, once, in the kitchen the morning after I called Derek. And I had listened to his argument and then said, "Do you understand that your mother's plan would have left me personally liable for $1 million federal loan with no group assets to support the repayment?" He said, "I know, it wasn't the right approach." I said, "Were you going to tell me that before or after I signed?" He did not answer that question. He looked at the counter. I went to work. Vivienne did not call me during those days. She called Gareth, according to things he mentioned in passing, several times a day. I did not know the content of those conversations. I did not need to know. What I needed was to be at the resumed hearing with Derek and the binder. The resumed creditor hearing was, in the technical sense, a short proceeding. Derek's presentation of the 3 documents, the co-borrower agreement, the equity rider, and the LC transfer date confirmation, took perhaps 20 minutes. The creditor committee asked 2 questions. Vivienne's attorney objected to the characterization of the LC transfer as a preference transfer. Derek provided the relevant federal insolvency statute and the transfer date. And the committee chair said he would take it under advisement. The supplier's attorney requested the private conference with Gareth's attorney that I have already described. What happened in those 11 minutes in the hallway, I don't know with certainty. What I know is that the supplier's attorney returned to the room with a changed position. The LLC transfer was, as Derek had indicated, potentially voidable. A supplier's claim against a group that had moved its newest and most valuable asset out of reach 14 months before the claim was filed was a much more complicated creditor proceeding than the settlement Vivienne had designed. The supplier's attorney wanted a negotiated solution. The group's attorney, after consulting briefly with Gareth, agreed to revisit the terms. I watched all of this from my seat at the conference table. The blue binder was open in front of me, turned to the equity rider page, the yellow tab visible above the binder's top edge. At some point during the proceedings, I had picked up a pen and written a short note to myself on a pad I had brought. 3 words. The name of the bank where I intended to open my own business account after all of this was resolved, which I had decided on during the proceedings because deciding it helped me feel that I was already moving toward what came next. I had not mentioned it to Gareth. It was not relevant to his plans. The 11-day renegotiation was methodical and, for me, largely indirect. Derek handled the day-to-day correspondence and kept me informed at the end of each day with a brief summary call. The restructured settlement terms came together gradually, piece by piece, with a specific friction of a process in which every party is adjusting to a set of facts they had not expected to be dealing with. Vivienne's removal from the operations committee was the term that took the longest. Her attorney argued several times that it was punitive rather than structural, and Derek countered each time with the argument that an operations committee that had authorized an undisclosed asset transfer without the documented co-owner's knowledge or consent was a governance risk that the restructured group could not sustain. The committee chair agreed. The term held. When the settlement documents were finalized and signed, I sat in Derek's conference room and initialed each page with the same care I had given to the original SPA loan 6 years earlier. I was not performing thoroughness. I was simply doing what I had always done with documents that carried my name. Gareth texted me afterward to say it was done and that he was glad it had worked out. I replied, "Thank you for letting me know." It was not the warmth he was looking for, and I knew that, and I was at a stage of things where I had no more warmth available for people who had not protected it when they had the chance. Let me tell you about the years before Derek, and before the binder, and before any of this was visible, because the story of how a person ends up at a creditor hearing with a 3-ring binder that saves everything is also the story of how a person ends up invisible in the first place, and that story is longer and quieter and less dramatic than the hearing itself. I had met Gareth at a hospitality industry event in Austin. The kind of industry gathering where everyone knows someone who knows someone and the conversations happen around food and over drinks and have a specific quality of professional warmth that can be mistaken for personal warmth if you are not paying close attention. Gareth was not mistaking it. He was genuinely warm. He asked me about my work with a kind of real curiosity that is unmistakable. The kind that listens to the answer, rather than waiting for the next turn to speak. We talked for an hour. He called the following week. We dated for 2 years before we married. In those 2 years, I came to understand Gareth's relationship with Vivienne well enough to have named the dynamics accurately if anyone had asked. But no one asked. And the dynamics were not yet my problem in any direct way, and there is a particular kind of tolerance we extend to the families of people we love that is not exactly denial, more like a considered decision that some things are in the background and some things are in the foreground, and for now, the foreground is what matters. I made that decision. I extended that tolerance. It is not a decision I would unmake, because the foreground was real and good, and the marriage had years of genuine partnership in it. But the background was always there, and it was always the background it turned out to be. When I stopped working full-time for the hotel group, 3 years into the marriage and 1 year before the SPA loan, the transition felt natural at the time. The restaurant group needed the kind of operational attention that I was good at providing, and the timing coincided with a restructuring at my hotel group that would have required a role change I didn't want. I told myself I could return to the industry whenever I chose to. I kept my certifications current. I kept my professional contacts active. What I did not keep, and this is the loss that I name cleanly now, without self-pity, was my own professional income, my own employer on my tax filings, my own forward momentum in the career I had built. The loss was gradual. It is always gradual. And because it is gradual, you accommodate each small reduction without registering that the accumulation of reductions has produced something significant. I accommodated Vivienne's exclusion of me from operational meetings because the first few felt like tests I hadn't yet passed. I accommodated not being on the group email list because Gareth said he would keep me informed, and he meant it when he said it, even when he failed to do it. I accommodated not being acknowledged at events and not being consulted on decisions that affected work I was doing, and not being thanked in any formal or public way for 9 years of unpaid, skilled operational contribution. I accommodated all of it because I was a practical person who understood that accommodation was sometimes what partnership required, and because the restaurants were succeeding, and because I loved Gareth even as I was becoming slowly, quietly, professionally smaller inside the life we shared. What I did not accommodate, what I had never accommodated, even in the years when I was accommodating everything else, was my father's principle about documents. That one I had never questioned. That one I had carried forward without erosion through every year of the marriage and every shift in my professional circumstances. I kept the physical copies. I organized them. I knew where they were. And when the evening came that I needed to know what I had signed 6 years earlier, I went to the hall closet, and I found it in under 2 minutes. I have thought about this many times since, about what separates the version of this story that ends with me signing the settlement documents from the version that ends with the creditor hearing and the restructured settlement, and my name formally on the group's ownership records. The difference is the binder, not the knowledge. Not some special intelligence about business law or creditor proceedings or SPA regulations, just the binder. The physical copy in the right section, organized the way my father had organized things, preserved for 6 years in a box in a closet that I walked past every day. My father died 4 years ago. He died without knowing any of this would happen, without knowing that the habit he had passed to me, the one he had repeated at every relevant moment in my childhood and early adulthood, would be the thing that determined the outcome of a creditor proceeding in Austin, Texas, when I was 41 years old. He would have been unsurprised by the outcome if he had known. He would have said, "Of course you found it. You kept the copy." That's what you do with the copy. I called Bet from the parking lot after the final settlement signing. She picked up on the first ring, which she always does when she knows something important has happened. I told her it was over and what the terms were. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad would have said, 'told you so.'" I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be," and I meant it in the way you mean something that is true in the future tense, not quite yet, but approaching. The drive home from Derek's office after the signing was 22 minutes. I took the long way, through the neighborhood streets rather than the highway, because I wanted the time to pass in a way that felt proportional to what had just ended. I had the binder in the back seat. I had not opened it since the hearing. I did not plan to open it for a long time. But I also did not plan to throw it away, or archive it somewhere inaccessible, or let it leave my possession. It was going into the desk drawer in the office I was about to set up, in the studio space in Mueller I had already signed a lease for, and it was going to stay there. The consulting practice opened 3 months after the settlement. I named it with my own surname. I registered it with the state under my own name. I opened a business bank account at the same credit union I had used personally for 12 years, in my own name, with my own signature authority and no secondary signatories. The first invoice I sent out was to a restaurant operator in the Bolden Creek neighborhood who needed help restructuring his vendor contracts, which I found quietly satisfying for reasons I did not explain to him. The work was good. It is still good. I am good at it in the way that I was good at it before, at the hotel group, before any of this happened. Because the skills do not atrophy the way the title does. The skills are mine. The knowledge is mine. The work I do now produces income with my name on it, and every document I sign in the course of that work goes into organized files that I maintain myself and know exactly where to find. There is something I want to tell you about the 2 years after the settlement, because the story does not end at the signing table, and the resolution of the legal proceedings does not resolve everything that the legal proceedings revealed. The question of what to do about the marriage was a separate question from the question of what to do about the settlement, and I handled it as a separate question because they required different kinds of attention and different timelines, and conflating them would have been dishonest about both. Gareth and I separated formally 4 months after the settlement. Not because the settlement was the cause, exactly. The settlement was more like a revelation of conditions that had already existed. A moment when the accumulated decisions of 9 years became legible at once rather than one at a time. A person who allows his mother to draft a settlement document that would have left his wife personally liable for a federal loan without telling his wife or advocating for her interests or even naming her stake in the proceedings until she found it herself. That person has made a series of choices about what and whom he protects. Those choices had been made. The settlement made them visible. The question of whether to stay in the marriage was the question of whether, now that the choices were visible, there was a way forward that was genuinely different from what had come before. I sat with that question for 4 months. I gave it the time it deserved. I concluded that there was not, at least not yet, not with enough certainty to recommit to, and that I would rather live with the clarity of the separation than with the uncertainty of a recovery I could not fully trust. The divorce proceedings were, compared to the creditor hearing, relatively uncomplicated. Derek referred me to a family law attorney. The marital estate was divided with the assistance of a mediator. The family home was sold, and the proceeds divided. My 10% ownership stake in the restaurant group was addressed in the divorce settlement. I negotiated a buyout of that stake at a fair valuation, which gave me a sum that I put, in part, into the consulting practice and in part into a savings account that I maintain under my own name at the credit union. The blue binder remained mine throughout. It was not in question. Vivienne, as far as I understand, remained in her ownership position in the restructured group. The third-party operator who took over the operations committee made changes to the management structure, to certain supplier relationships, to the way operational decisions were processed and documented that have, from what I have heard secondhand, improved the group's efficiency. Gareth continued to be the public face of the restaurants, which is genuinely where his talent lies. I have seen him once since the divorce, at an industry event I attended for a client meeting. We exchanged a brief, civil acknowledgement across a crowded room. It was sufficient. The South Congress restaurant is still there. I have been back twice since the divorce, once with a client who wanted to understand how the concept had evolved, once alone for lunch, on a Tuesday when the room was half full, and the menu had changed, and the servers were people I didn't recognize. I sat at a corner table and ordered the kind of meal you order when you are not performing anything. And I watched the room that I had spent 9 years helping to maintain from outside the room for the first time. It was a good restaurant. It had always been a good restaurant. That was a real thing that we had built together, and I was willing to acknowledge it as real even after everything else. What I keep now is a different kind of record than the one I was keeping during the marriage. Not a record of the family business, not a record of the shared finances, not a record of things that belong to a life I am no longer living. A record of my own work, my own clients, my own agreements, my own income. Every invoice I send is filed by client and date. Every contract I sign has a physical copy in the drawer with the blue binder. Every account I hold is in my name alone, organized by the same principles my father taught me, the ones I have carried without interruption since I was 12 years old and he was explaining why the copy was important. He was right. He was right in the general way that documentation protects you, that the copy preserves your position, and he was right in the specific way. In a creditor hearing in Austin, Texas, that I did not anticipate, and that he did not live to see. The binder worked exactly the way the habit was supposed to work, not because I was brilliant or strategic or because I had anticipated this particular situation, not because I had been preparing for a creditor hearing, because I had been careful, in the ordinary way, in the way he had taught me, and the care had accumulated into a document that was there when I needed it. Sylvia was invisible until her signature was the only one in the room that mattered. If someone asks you to sign something as just a formality, read it first. Read every page, every rider, every attached exhibit. Keep your copy. Know where the copy is. And if this story reached someone you know who has been told their name on a document doesn't matter, share it with them. It matters. Every time. Thank you for being here today. Leave me your city in the comments, and I'll see you next time.